Welcome to Nikki's Nightmares, where chilling tales come to life. In today's terrifying episode, we venture deep into the wilderness to uncover a collection of creepy camping encounters that blur the line between bad luck, human evil, and the unexplained. From silent figures emerging from the darkness, to mysterious strangers lurking on remote trails, to eerie voices echoing through the forest after midnight, these unsettling true camping stories will make you think twice before spending a night beneath the trees. Because sometimes the most terrifying things in the woods aren't animals. They're the things watching from just beyond the firelight. If you love scary stories, paranormal encounters, true horror experiences, and creepy camping tales, you're in the right place. Make sure to like, subscribe, and join me as we delve into the deep, dark, and the mysterious. 4 Figures in the Darkness. I've always enjoyed spending time outdoors, but after what happened during one camping trip, I've never looked at the wilderness the same way again. It happened a few years ago while I was camping alone in the backcountry near where I lived. I've never been much of a hardcore hiker, so I usually stick to trails that are only a mile or two from civilization. This particular campsite sat beside a quiet lake just over a mile from the trailhead where I had left my truck. It was remote enough to feel isolated, but close enough that I never considered it dangerous. I had planned to spend the entire weekend there and was already settling into the peaceful rhythm of camp life. On the 3rd day, I decided to hike back to my truck to grab my fishing rod and some extra food. The walk was uneventful, and before long I was making my way back through the trees toward the lake. That's when I noticed something that immediately felt out of place. A second tent had appeared. It sat farther down the shoreline near the water's edge, partially hidden by a cluster of trees. The strange thing wasn't that someone else was camping there. It was how suddenly it seemed to have appeared. I hadn't seen anyone on the trail all day. In fact, there was only one trail leading to that part of the lake, and I was almost certain nobody had passed me. Still, I figured there might be another route I didn't know about. At the time, I brushed it off. I set up my fishing rod and spent the afternoon casting into the still water. Every so often I'd glance toward the unfamiliar tent. Nothing, no movement, no voices, no campfire smoke, and nobody entering or leaving. As the hours passed, the silence surrounding that tent began to feel increasingly unsettling. Eventually, the sun began its slow descent behind the trees, painting the lake in shades of orange and gold. I packed up my fishing gear and returned to my own campsite. After eating dinner, I gathered sticks for a fire and waited for darkness to settle over the forest. When I finally lit the campfire, the flames crackled to life and pushed back the darkness around me. That's when I saw it. A shadow. Far beyond the reach of the firelight, something moved between the trees. For just a moment, I caught the outline of a person standing in the forest, watching. I assumed it was the owner of the tent down by the lake, perhaps collecting firewood or wandering back toward camp. It was a little strange that they happened to be standing near my campsite the moment I lit my fire, but I convinced myself there was nothing unusual about it. The wilderness has a way of making ordinary things seem eerie after dark, so I ignored it. I leaned back in my chair and relaxed. The fire crackled softly. The lake reflected the moonlight. The stars hung overhead in a sky untouched by city lights. It was peaceful, almost hypnotic. At one point I nearly drifted off to sleep. Then everything changed. About 30 minutes later, I happened to glance beyond the fire and into the darkness surrounding camp. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Then I saw them. Several figures emerging from the forest. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 men were walking directly toward my campsite. A knot formed instantly in my stomach. I stood up slowly and tried to convince myself they were just another group of campers. Maybe they needed help. Maybe they were lost. But as they entered the glow of the firelight, every instinct in my body screamed that something was wrong. None of them smiled. None of them introduced themselves. They simply stared. All 4 appeared to be in their 30s or 40s, their expressions cold and unreadable. Without saying a word, 2 of the men moved behind me toward my tent while the other 2 stepped forward. Then they shoved me aside. The situation escalated so quickly that my brain struggled to process what was happening. I knew immediately this wasn't a misunderstanding. These men hadn't stumbled across my camp by accident. They were there for a reason. I watched helplessly as the 2 men at my tent began tearing through my belongings. The other 2 continued pushing me farther away from the campsite, away from the fire, away from the light. I tried talking to them. I asked them what they wanted and told them they could take whatever they needed. But none of them responded. It was as though I wasn't even a person to them, just an obstacle. I kept reminding myself not to fight back. There were 4 of them and only 1 of me. Whatever they wanted, it wasn't worth dying over. But then they continued dragging me deeper into the woods. The darkness swallowed us almost immediately. The glow of my campfire grew smaller and smaller until it was barely visible through the trees. Every step made my pulse pound harder. Every second felt worse than the last. After what felt like an eternity, they finally stopped. The forest was completely silent. No wind, no insects, nothing. I turned to face them. And in that moment, every terrifying possibility flooded my mind at once. One of the men reached towards something at his side. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I ran. I've never run that fast in my life. Branches whipped against my arms. Leaves and dirt flew beneath my feet. My lungs burned as I sprinted blindly through the darkness. The only sound was my own breathing and the frantic pounding of my footsteps. I expected to hear them chasing me. I expected shouts, footsteps, something, but there was nothing. Just silence. Eventually I found the trail and followed it all the way back to the parking area where my truck was waiting. When I finally reached it, exhausted and shaking, I realized nobody had followed me, at least not that I could see. I immediately contacted the police and reported everything that had happened. Unfortunately, there wasn't much they could do. By the time officers reached the campsite, most of my belongings were gone. There were no useful clues, no clear tracks, and no indication of who the 4 men were or where they had come from. To this day, I still think about that night. The stolen equipment never bothered me. What haunts me is wondering what would have happened if I hadn't run when I did. Those men weren't interested in simply taking my gear. I could feel it. Something far worse was waiting for me in that darkness. And every now and then, when I remember the way they silently emerged from the trees and surrounded my campfire, I realize just how close I may have come to never leaving that forest at all. The man at our campsite wasn't a ranger. My brother Caleb and I moved to western Montana several years ago. We'd both always dreamed of living close to the mountains, but neither of us could afford a place on our own. Sharing a small rental outside the city solved that problem, and before long we found ourselves surrounded by endless forests, winding trails, and rugged peaks. The only downside was that everyone else seemed to have the same idea. Most of the trails near us were packed year-round. Hikers, campers, tourists, It didn't matter the season. Finding any real solitude was nearly impossible. So when Caleb suggested a 3-day backpacking trip deep into a less traveled section of the wilderness, I jumped at the chance. A few weeks later, we loaded our gear and drove to the trailhead before sunrise. When we arrived, there was only one other vehicle parked there, an old mud-covered SUV that looked like it had survived a war. Seeing just a single vehicle gave us hope that we'd have the mountains mostly to ourselves. The hike in was long. Nearly 8 miles of winding trail led us through dense pine forests and across rocky ridges. Most of the route was manageable, but the final stretch climbed steeply up the side of a mountain. By the time we reached our destination, my legs felt like they were on fire. Still, the view made every step worthwhile. Our campsite sat on a narrow shelf overlooking a vast valley. As the sun disappeared behind distant peaks, the entire landscape glowed in shades of orange and crimson. It felt isolated, peaceful, at least at first. After setting up camp, we gathered wood and built a small fire. We spent hours talking, enjoying the silence that only exists deep in the wilderness. Then we heard footsteps. Both of us stopped talking immediately. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was walking up the trail toward our campsite. The footsteps grew louder until a figure finally emerged from the darkness beyond the firelight. What struck me first was the fact that he wasn't carrying a flashlight or wearing a headlamp. Any experienced hiker knows how dangerous that is after dark. As the man stepped closer, a knot formed in my stomach. Something felt wrong. He wore an odd smile that never seemed to leave his face. "Can we help you?" Caleb asked, standing up. The man looked at him, then at me, still smiling. He claimed he was a park ranger. According to him, the area was closed and we'd have to leave immediately. The story made no sense. We had obtained all the necessary permits only a day earlier. More importantly, no legitimate ranger would be hiking remote mountain trails in complete darkness without proper equipment. The man continued smiling. "You need to pack up right now," he said. "Follow me. I'll take you back down." The way he said it sent a chill through me. Not a suggestion, not advice, an order. For several seconds nobody spoke. The fire crackled between us while the stranger stood there staring. Finally, Caleb shook his head. "No, we're staying here." The man's smile never changed. Without another word, he turned and disappeared back into the darkness. We listened to his footsteps fade away, but neither of us relaxed. That entire night, neither of us slept. Every sound outside our tents made us tense. More than once, I thought I heard footsteps circling somewhere beyond the trees. Whenever I looked, there was nothing there, just darkness. When dawn finally arrived, we packed our gear and abandoned the trip. As we returned to the trailhead, the same battered SUV was still sitting exactly where we'd seen it the day before. I remember staring at it and wondering whether its owner had encountered the same smiling stranger, or if they had followed him into the woods. We reported everything to local authorities, but nothing ever came of it. The man was never identified, and no ranger matching his description worked in the area. To this day, I don't know what he wanted. But I know one thing. People don't hike through remote mountains in total darkness pretending to be park rangers for innocent reasons. The choir in the woods. Back in the summer of 2004, I worked as a counselor at a remote Boy Scout camp tucked deep within the wilderness. Every week, part of my job was leading a group of campers out to a secluded area where they would earn their wilderness survival badge. The boys had to build their own shelters from branches, leaves, and whatever they could find in the forest, then spend the night sleeping inside them. The location wasn't actually that far from the main camp, maybe half a mile at most, but we always took a winding route through the woods to make it feel much more isolated. One particular night still lingers in my memory. The campers had finished building their shelters, dinner had been cooked over the fire, and everyone was settling in. Around 11 o'clock, I sent the boys off to sleep while the other staff members and I stayed behind to clean up the campsite. That was when we heard it, faint at first, distant, church bells. The sound drifted through the darkness from somewhere beyond the trees, slow, deliberate, a bell ringing every 30 seconds or so. The woods around us were completely silent otherwise. We all stopped what we were doing and listened. There were no churches nearby, no towns, nothing but miles of forest in every direction. Yet the bells continued for nearly half an hour. Then they stopped. For a few moments, the night was silent again. And then the singing began. It sounded like a choir, dozens, maybe hundreds of voices blending together somewhere far away in the darkness. The words were impossible to make out, but the sound carried eerily well through the forest. Sometimes it became so faint that we thought it had ended. Then it would swell again, louder than before, as if it were moving closer. The campers were terrified. Honestly, so were we. I lied and told them it was probably a church service back at camp, even though I knew that wasn't true. It was nearly midnight by then, and there was no reason for anyone to be singing in the woods. For more than an hour, the voices echoed through the darkness. Then, just before 1 in the morning, everything stopped. The bells, the singing, all of it. The forest fell silent once again. A few days later, I finally learned what had caused it. There had been a massive clan rally taking place only a few miles from our campsite that night. The bells, the chanting, the choir-like singing we'd heard drifting through the woods had come from there. Looking back, the explanation makes sense. But standing in that dark forest, listening to those distant voices carry across the trees at midnight, it felt like we were hearing something far older and far more sinister. The stranger on the trail. I was 18 years old when a few friends and I decided to take a road trip deep into the wilderness. It was one of those impulsive adventures that only seems like a good idea when you're young enough to believe nothing bad can happen to you. We drove for hours into a sprawling national forest, far away from cities, highways, and anyone who might tell us to stop doing what we were doing. The plan was simple: set up camp, drink cheap beer, explore the woods, and enjoy a weekend away from civilization. By the time we arrived, the sun was already beginning to sink behind the endless wall of pine trees. We found a secluded clearing deep in the forest, pitched our tents, cracked open a few cold beers, and settled in for the evening. After a while, one of my friends suggested we go explore. The two of us walked away from camp and followed a dirt road until we found a narrow trail cutting into the woods on the opposite side. It looked abandoned, almost forgotten. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then we started noticing signs that someone had been living out there. Large bags of garbage were scattered among the trees, broken supplies, empty containers, strange little traces of long-term habitation where there shouldn't have been any. Looking back, every instinct should have told us to turn around. Instead, we kept walking. We were young. We thought we were invincible. The trail eventually opened into a small makeshift campsite hidden among the trees. An old white van sat parked beneath the canopy. Clotheslines stretched between branches. Coolers were stacked nearby. A large golden retriever wandered lazily around the camp. And standing beside the van was an older man. The moment he spotted us, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. We immediately tried to back away, but he waved and called out to us. So we stopped. The man seemed friendly enough. He asked where we were from. He talked about the surrounding wilderness and recommended several hiking areas and national forests we should visit someday. At first glance, he appeared harmless, but something about him felt wrong. Even now, years later, I can still remember it. His movements seemed strangely unsteady, not drunk exactly, more like someone constantly fighting to maintain balance. He swayed side to side as he walked, almost as if the ground beneath him wasn't stable. Then there was the way he gave directions. Every location he mentioned was measured in steps. Not miles, not yards, steps, hundreds of steps this way, thousands of steps that way. At the time I thought it was odd, nothing more. But the thing that stands out most in my memory is how intensely interested he was in the parks and forests near our hometown. He wanted details, names, locations, trails, campgrounds. He seemed fascinated by isolated places. After about 10 minutes of conversation, we left and returned to our campsite. By the next morning, we'd completely forgotten about him. 2 months later, I received a phone call late at night. It was the same friend who had explored the trail with me. His voice sounded shaken. He told me to turn on the television. I was irritated. I thought he was messing with me. Then he said, "Just watch." The news broadcast showed an older man. Then it showed a white van. And finally, it showed a golden retriever. The instant I saw that dog, every hair on my body stood up. I knew exactly who I was looking at. The man from the woods, the man we'd stood and chatted with, the man we'd shared travel stories with. His name was Gary Michael Hilton. Authorities had identified him as a serial killer responsible for multiple murders across several states. As investigators revealed details of the case, my stomach dropped. Victims had disappeared from some of the exact locations he had enthusiastically discussed with us during that conversation in the forest. Places he seemed to know intimately, places where people had vanished. Not long after our encounter, another victim was murdered in that very forest. The realization hit me like a truck. We had been standing face to face with a predator, a man capable of unimaginable violence, and we never knew it. We immediately contacted law enforcement and eventually found ourselves speaking with federal investigators. Not long afterward, we were flown back to the forest. We walked the same trail again, passed the same trees, returned to the same hidden campsite. Investigators asked us to identify every detail we could remember, every object, every location, every word he had spoken. Years later, after the trial had concluded, I learned something that still chills me whenever I think about it. Investigators reportedly discovered what appeared to be partially destroyed human finger bones in an area near that campsite. I was later called to testify about our encounter. Even now, decades later, I sometimes think about how easily that story could have ended differently. We were young, lost deep in the wilderness, standing alone with a man whose face would soon appear on national news broadcasts, a man who was already hunting, and for reasons I'll never understand, he let us walk away. The story ends here, but the terror does not. Join me again, like, comment, and subscribe if you dare.